After the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor, it was 6 long months before U.S. forces could claim a significant victory in the Pacific. The U.S. victory at Midway marked a turning point in the Pacific and paved the way for the brutal island-hopping campaign. The U.S. Navy and Marine Corps battled through the Solomon Islands, the Gilbert Islands, the Marshall Islands, and the Palau Islands. 28 months later, the U.S. forces were at the doorstep of the Philippine island. A meeting that took place in Honolulu in July of 1944 between President Roosevelt, General MacArthur, and Admiral Nimitz determined the route for the American advance on Japan. Much deliberation was put into whether the Philippines or Formosa would be the base for the invasion into the Ryukyu Islands and ultimately to mainland Japan. MacArthur and Nimitz disagreed on the subject. MacArthur viewed the Philippines as the better vantage point, and Nimitz favored Formosa. After much deliberation, the route through the Philippines was chosen because it would require fewer men, which meant the attack would commence sooner rather than having to wait for reinforcements from the European campaign to be dispatched to the Pacific. The main U.S. forces consisted of 2 arms, the 3rd Fleet commanded by Admiral Halsey and the 7th Fleet commanded by Admiral Kinkaid. The U.S. force of 211 ships consisted of many types of ships and about 1,500 land and carrier-based planes. The backbone of the fleet was the Essex-class aircraft carriers that carried around 100 aircraft. The main aircraft deployed by the carrier were the TBF Avenger torpedo bomber, armed with the Bliss-Leavitt Mark 13 torpedo, the F-6F Hellcat fighter aircraft armed with 6 15-inch 12.7mm M2 Browning air-cooled machine guns and 6 HVAR rockets, and the SB-2C Helldiver bomber aircraft armed with 2,000 pounds of payload. The U.S. battleships also proved to be vital against the Japanese fleet and were used to pound the Philippine coast and nearby ships. Their 16-inch 50 caliber Mark 7 guns would fire 2,500 pound projectiles 2,600 feet per second with a maximum range of 24 miles. The fall of the Philippines would be disastrous for the Japanese. In response to a looming American invasion, the Japanese command, which included Admiral Kurita and Admiral Ozawa, devised a defensive plan. Shogo 1 was the defensive of the Philippines, while Shogo 2 was the defensive of Formosa, both plans meaning victory. Admiral Kurita's orders as a part of Shogo 1 was to break through the Lacobon area of Dam on October 25th, and after first destroying the enemy's surface forces, he was to destroy the landing forces. The much smaller Japanese force consisted of 68 ships and about 300 land and carrier-based aircraft. The only carrier the Japanese fleet had during this battle, Tsukaka, and the only remaining survivor of the 6 fleet carriers that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor. Her aircraft arsenal contained 18 A6M-0 fighters armed with 2 7.7mm Type 97 machine guns and 2 20mm Type 99 cannons in the wings, 27 IHE D-3A dive bombers armed with 2 fixed forward 7.7mm guns and 1,500 pound bombs, and 27 Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers armed with 1 Type 91 1,000 pound torpedoes. The battleships used by the Japanese were quite similar to the ships used by the U.S. forces, but they contained the largest caliber naval gun ever fitted to a warship, the 40cm 18.1-inch 45 Type 94 guns. Admiral Halsey and the 3rd Fleet began with a series of raids against Formosa and the Ryukyu Islands. Therefore, the Japanese command put Shogo 2 into action. It was a fight between carrier-based and land-based air power. Japan lost horribly, losing 600 aircraft. Once the U.S. forces attacked the Philippines, it forced the Japanese to transition to Shogo 1. Halsey's attack on Formosa proved invaluable. Without sufficient land-based air power, the Japanese fleet was vastly outnumbered and unprotected. Japanese command knew the importance of this campaign. Admiral Toyota stated during interrogation some time later, "Should we lose in the Philippine operations, even though the fleet should be left, the shipping lane to the south would be completely cut off so that the fleet, if it should come back to the Japanese waters, could not obtain its fuel supply. If it should remain in southern waters, it could not receive supplies of ammunition and arms. there would be no sense in saving the fleet at the expense of the loss of the Philippines. Retaining the Philippines was vital. On October 23, 1944, off the island of Palawan, 2 U.S. submarines, Darter and Dace, spotted Admiral Kurita's force and followed them on the surface instead of diving. They were spotted, but Admiral Kurita did not take the appropriate anti-submarine actions. The 2 submarines were able to gain an advanced position ahead of the Japanese force, which allowed them to perform a submerged attack. The 2 submarines were able to sink 2 of Kurita's cruisers and seriously damage another. This is considered only a minor conflict and was completely unplanned. This was the result of 2 different groups of ships bumping into one another unexpectedly. The submarine attack was very successful though. The 2 submarines attacked a force of close to 30 ships. Kurita's force would then have to continue to advance despite its losses and would continue to be involved in the fighting over the next several days. The following day, October 24th, several Hellcat fighters, Helldiver dive bombers, and Avenger torpedo bombers launched from the USS Enterprise and spotted and attacked Admiral Kurita's fleet as it was entering the Sibuyan Sea. This attack did not yield much damage, but it alerted Admiral Halsey and his fleet to the Japanese presence in the area. Before this airstrike had occurred, Admiral Halsey had sent 2 of his carrier groups to refuel. As a result, they were delayed in arriving to the battle and would only play minor roles. He also delayed in calling them back, which further made them ineffective. Several planes launched from the carriers Intrepid and Cabot had much more luck in engaging the enemy. They were able to make several direct hits on Kurita's large battleships and were able to slow down their advance. Another wave of planes from the carriers were able to sink several ships, including the Musashi, which was the largest and most heavily armed battleship ever built. The Japanese fleet had no answer for the U.S. dive bombers and attack aircraft. Kurita's fleet took substantial fire from these planes. The Japanese were able to launch some of their own land-based planes from Luzon, but most of these were intercepted. One plane did manage to drop a bomb on the USS Princeton, and the ensuing explosion that resulted ended up forcing the Princeton to eventually be scuttled, making it the only casualty of this portion of the battle. The series of airstrikes show how effective and superior the U.S. had become. Also, the inability of the U.S. fleet to slow down Kurita's advance allowed him to advance further towards the San Bernardino Strait towards the island of Samar.